The way they transferred over is that they would redeem them with chulin, and then they become chulin, and then they're repurchased with the noise from the Lishka Chadasha. And the question was, which is the question that Chisda asked, is it in fact possible to discharge the Kedusha just like that? And the lotion that he used was, Kedusha Shebehen Lahechen Hocha. So the Gemara said, you make it sound like this is such a new concept. This is already a concept that's used in other places, such as for the Keteris. The Keteris had the same problem. Kamar Chodesh Nisan, the existing Keteris was purchased with the old Lishka money. We need now new Lishka money. How do we do the transfer? So the way it was done is really technically it could have been dealt with just like the behemoths were dealt with. They could be paid it with chulin, sell it to chulin, and then buy it back. The reason why that wasn't done, Zok Rashi, is because Keteris has an extra kedusha, and they didn't want to make it go like in Gansen l'chulin, as Rashi says, v'loy l'machar v'lachser v'l'knoisa the zila milsa. It's not respectful for something like Keteris. So what they would do is they would take the money that they were going to pay Beis Haftinas to make the Keteris with, and they would use that money, which is chulin money that's going to be given to the Beis Haftinas, to buy the Keteris. Therefore, the Keteris goes l'chulin and it's given to the actual employees of Beis Haftinas, and then the new Lishka would buy it back from them. That's how they would do it. So the question would be the same thing. V'amai name a kedusha bahan shebahan laheichen hocha. Omer Larry. So I believe it's Rabbah who answered back. Who is this conversation going on? It's Yosy Rabbah. So Rabbah said, Keteris ka'amrit. You're asking me a question from Keteris, shiny Keteris, the Kedusha's domim. Keteris is not like these animals. The animals are Kedushas aguf, and you cannot be paid to them. And I maintain the Kedusha is lahech and hocha. But Keteris, you could do it because Keteris never took on Kedushas aguf. And Rashi tells us that unlike a behemoth, where the moment you designate it for a carbon, it automatically becomes Kedushas aguf. Other things don't. The other things that you want to designate for kodesh have to first be placed into a clay kodesh, into a clay sharis. Now the question is, the keteris have to be ground in a machteshes. Is that machteshes a clay sharis? Rashi tells us it's not. So therefore, even though you have the ground keteris that was clearly in a machteshes, nevertheless it's still at the level of kedushas domim, and it has not yet reached the level of kedushas aguf. And that's why you could be paid. So once again, the question will be on the animals. But now we're diverting and we're discussing Keteris, and the Gemara just said that Keteris is Kedusha Stam. Tful Yoim is somebody who already toiveled from his tumah, but he still didn't wait for Harav Shemesh till the end of the day. By Kachim, even after the end of the day, you have to bring Karbonis to allow you to come back into the Beis Hamikdash. So Tful Yoim would not be able to be poisel a hekdesh that's Kedushas Domim, but a hekdesh that's Kedushas Guf, like a carbon, that a Tful Yoim will pass. The problem is, Allah Matanya, we learned that in fact Keteris will become possible with a Tful Yoim. Tanya Nosna b'machteshes, once it's in the machteshes, so it's Keteris now, Nivselas b'Tful Yoim. If you're going to claim that it only has Kedushas Domim and not Kedushas Aguf, why is Keteris possible b'Tful Yoim? Elamai, B'chitema, Kol Kedushas Domim, Mivsali b'Tful Yoim, if you're going to argue on our premise that it's not exclusive to Kedushas Aguf, that it becomes possible with Tful Yoim, that's something that even happens to Kedushas Domim. I'll prove to you from a Brisa, from a Mishnah, that you cannot Kachim will not become Tomei or possible with a Tful Yoim unless it's Kedushas Aguf. Where do you see that? From Hamanachis, but not Hamanachis. The moment someone is makdish, he designates this flour for a mincha. If someone has enough from it, he's moil. But that's the extent of its level of kedusha. But kitchu b'chli, once he brought it to the Beis Hamikdash and the flour was placed into a klei that they're going to be using to prepare the mincha with, huchsharu, now it just bumped up a level and it just became, we'll call it now kedushas aguf, lifasel b'tful yoy. That's what we're looking for. Uva mechusik yipurim, uva lina. So we see clearly that kosher b'chli'in, when does it take on this special kedusha that it becomes possible with a full yoim? That's if it was in the klei sharish, if it took on the level of kedushas aguf. But loy kitchu b'kli, if it's still kedushas tamim loy. So you see clearly that it cannot become a full yoim unless it's kedushas aguf. So in order to explain the brisa that says that ketores becomes possible b'tful yoim, it must be that ketores, even before it got into the klei sharish, the moment it was in the machteshes, must have kedushas aguf. Elamai kedushas agufi. Now, so now you want to claim that ketores is a kedushas aguf, which takes us back to the original question: is kedusha shabahen lahechan hol? When it's in the machteshes before it's placed into a klei sharish. But now I'm going to prove to you that it's not kedushas aguf, because if it is kedushas aguf, and that's going to help you explain why it's possible with tful yoim. Elamayata tifasel belina, lina and tful yoim only apply to something with kedushas aguf. Yet we're going to demonstrate that the fact that it was merely in a machteshes, but not yet in the klei sharish, will not allow the ketores to become possible with lina. Alamatanan, why did we learn? That ketores is what we're focused on. All these items, when they just become kodesh, they're designated, that's when there's a din me'ila on them. But until there's a kitcha b'kli, we don't have the following items, because kitcha b'kli is hukshu lifasel utfil yoim uvemechusik yipurim uvelina. So you see, until it's in a klei sharish, it will not become possible with lina. A kitcha b'kli in loy kitcha b'kli loy. So kum techais, you want a taina that it's kedushas aguf. If it's kedushas aguf, it should be possible lina. You can't have it both ways. If the ketores inventory is not going to become possible with lina, well then it can't be kedushas aguf. If it's not kedushas aguf, you need to explain how it could become possible with a full yoim. Amar lei, the Gemara answered, lina ka amrit. Your whole problem is why is it not possible lina, and that's how you want to prove that ketores is not kedushas aguf. Ketores is in fact kedushas aguf, and even though it's kedushas aguf, it's still not. Ketores is in fact kedushas aguf. That's right. I'm not misspeaking. Ketores is in fact kedushas aguf the moment it's in the machteshes, and that's why it's possible with full yoim. So why isn't it possible with lina? Lina kamrit shiny ketores hol v'tzurasa b'chol hashana kula. Ketores does not change at all. It remains static all year long, and therefore it will not become possible with lina. Unlike meat or other perishables, that lina, when it stays out overnight, it's going to lose a part of its exact tzur. It'll look a little differently, and that's in fact how ketores is made. We usually make it once a year for the whole year, so it's designed to last a whole year. Therefore, there is no psul of lina for ketores. So you're going to ask, so why is it once you put it into a klei sharish, why is there a psulina like we learned in this Mishnah? That's only exer derabanan. We're afraid if once the ketores is already in active use, if we're going to allow it to be used, even though there's lina, you might also not realize that there's a distinction with other karbanos. So frag the Gemara. Okay, so now we've answered our steer about ketores. We know that ketores, once it's in the machteshes, we know it's kedushas aguf, and that's why it's possible with full yoim. It's not possible with lina because there's no psulina midaraisa on ketores, and we only put a derabanic psul of lina on ketores once it's in the klei sharish itself. But that was the diversion. Let's get back to our sugya. The Gemara's right from Ketores was, everybody agrees that's how you read in Ketores. Nobody complains. If you have an argument on the behemoths, on the Tamidim, why wouldn't that kasha apply equally to the Ketores? Amarabba, I'll tell you a pasha to Teretz, Lev Bezdin Masna Lehem. What's unique about the carbon tamid these animals that we set aside for the carbon tamid, which is equally unique about the Ketores, is that when Bezdin initially makes them Kodesh, when Bezdin initially purchases them, either for the sake of Ketores or for the sake of the Tamidim, they make a Tanai at the time. Im hutzrichu, if these will be needed for its intended purpose, meaning to be done this year, to be used this year before Chodesh Nisan, then we want them to have Kedusha. Vim lav, but if they're not going to be needed for this year and they're going to be left over to next year, they should only be Kodesh for their Domim. Zok Rashi, what does Lev Bez and Masna Le mean? B'shas lekicha, when they originally buy these animals or this Ketores, the loy likdishu Kedusha Saguf ela tzrichin l'shana. Only the amount that's required for this year should take on Kedusha Saguf. But any extra should not take on Kedusha Saguf. So therefore we could redeem it. Therefore the whole kasha of a Kedusha Shaban Leichanocha is no longer relevant because there was no Kedusha Saguf on the part that's not going to be used for the current year. Whenever we're talking about communal purchases, Noisten Bezdin Lev. That's where the Bezdin's intention are what dictate the terms of the sale because it's a communal sale. So Abai still doesn't like this. He told Rabbah, Amar, you yourself said that you can, and I think Moshe Weinberg asked this question. When you're makdish an animal that could be royal to be brought on the Mizbech as a carbon, hikdish zachar ledamav, and you said I'm only being makdish for its value, you want to make it into a bedek abayis, the halach is automatically kadosh kedusha saguf. An animal, when you're makdish it, by default becomes kadosh kedusha saguf. So the question is, these are all karbonas. If we're talking about karbonas like animals, how could lev bezn masna aleim? This is not deniable stuff. An animal by default takes on kedusha saguf. Zogt Rashi, Mamar Damav Masechus Tamura, Hikdish Zachal Damav. For instance, Hikdish Ayel L'Damav. If you makdish a ram, which could be a carbon, but you said I only want it to be the value of it, the halach is Kaddish Kedusha Saguf automatic. Therefore, you no longer like you could right? Since they were makdish this animal, the who atzmai royal akrova, and this animal itself can be brought on the mizbeach. It's unlike if you donated a car where they have to liquidate it in order to buy something with it. This bema can be directly used for what the mizbeach needs. It doesn't leave its qualification, its designation towards the mizbeach. V'hachanami l'may mahani tnoy lev bezin. How does lev bezin help when they're buying animals? Automatically it'll be kachi lahu legufayu because of this rule of Rabbah that hik the zachar adam of kadosh kedusha saguf. Zakmor lekasha had amar ledmei ayla had amar ledmei nisachim. Where do you say that it automatically becomes a carbon if you're makdish an animal that can be used for an oila and you say it shouldn't be used for an oila, its money should be used for an oila? There it automatically becomes an oila. But if you said that I'm designating these animals ledmei nisachim, an animal can't be used for nisachim. It will have to be sold. It will have to be liquidated. There is where you say lev bezin masnalem. The problem over here is, if we understand it properly, they're buying animals over here, right? They are buying animals. So let's just take a peek in Rashi. The Rashi over here for this Gemara is actually at the top of the Amud Beis. So let's just turn over for a minute to see the Rashi. Rashi says, Had Amar Ledmei Oila. He Amri Ana Kadosh Kedusha Saguf. Where did Rabbah say the animal automatically takes on Kedusha Saguf? Hechad Amar Yehei Lahavi Bidamav Oila. I'm donating this animal so it should be sold, and with the money of the proceeds of the sale, you should buy another carbon. There you don't say it works. You say it becomes Kedusha Saguf. The given the Il Chazi Lachi Loimas Vininle. Abul Amar, what if he said, I'm giving this animal and Yehei Ledmei Nisachim? I want them to be used to buy Nisachim with. Even though the Nesachim, if you actually donated wine, they would also take on Kedusha Saguf. Kedusha Sayu Damian Ladodi, it has the same Kedusha Saguf as the Kedusha Saguf for a behema, but Kivan the Lahachi Chazi Mizdavid, since you cannot pour a cow, you have to pour wine. So therefore, we say it does not take on Kedusha Saguf. The Cholshka and Hecha the Masnu Bezdin. Here's the clicker. the Chol Sheken Hecha, the Masnu Bezdin, just want to get it exactly right to read the base. Sheyehei Lidmei Moiser Truma Shila Riku Pachim. Here Bezdin said, these some animals, yes, I want them to take on Kedushas V'Guf, the ones that we're going to use, but the other animals I'm not giving those a carbon. I'm designating them L'Rikuya Pachin, which is to buy gold out of it that you will flatten out and use it as a plating for the base Kodesh HaKodeshim, which is what the Gemara said you do with the extra money. So therefore, in this case, those animals were in fact not donated for a carbon. Those were donated to get the value out of them, to buy gold with, to use as plating for the walls of the Kodesh HaKodeshim. Yes. And buy it later, and I guess they want to have animals ready to go. Because they had an inventory of animals that they had already pre-checked for moment. If they're going to be liquidating the animals, they wouldn't bother checking. Okay, so to Gemara weiter. Esrei Abaye. So this answer of Lav Bezin and there was Ledmei Nesachim can easily be used to explain the Tamidim, but by the Ketores you can use it as well. Esrei Abaye. Par v'soyer shal Yom HaKippur. Now normally we said that any one of the Sir HaRegalim or the Sir HaSchodesh or even the Sir Azazel that got lost, you could repurpose it. And you can, if it got lost and you replace it and then you found it, what do you do with the animal that you found? You can use it for any Yom Tov, you can use it for a Chodesh. And the Gemara's reasoning, the Mishnah told us, is because it's all the same type of carbon for Tumas Mikdash V'Kedosha. What about the Par V'Seir Shel Yom HaKippurim? So this is the Sir Pnimi that the dam is spritzed in the Kodesh, either in the Kodesh Kedoshim or in the Heichal. They got lost. And then you had to replace them, and then they were found. Go to Gemara on Daf Yud Aleph on base, and then they were found. Or v'chein seirei avodah zara. Now seirei avodah zara are not brought on Yom Kippur. They're actually brought any time during the year where Klal Yisrael is over on a Isra avodah zara. Rashi says tzibur shachat b'avodah zara. By Bezdin was matir, so it was like a Helen Dovish on Tzibor. They bring two animals as a carbon. They bring a par la'oila and a seir lechatos. K'dichsiv b'parsha shlach lecha. And the ois and seir, that seir that they bring as a chatos, matan domoy ala paroiches yal mizbech hazov. They are, the dam is spritzed not like a regular carbon chatos. That dam is spritzed like a carbon that was brought on Yom Kippur. So they're different than any other carbon that you might bring. Sha'abdu, and then they were discovered, they were found. Kulam yamusu, divrei Rabbi Yehuda. These cannot be repurposed. They all die, as Rashi explains. The loidamu l'sir haragolim. They're not similar to a seer of chatos that's brought by the musafin of the Yom Tovim that we learned about yesterday. From Musair or Seir. The Tanadu, the Masnichin, our Mishnah explicitly states about these seirim. If you weren't makavit one Yom Tov, you could save it for a different Yom Tov, as the Mishnah said several times, because it's all mechaper on the same idea of Tumas, Mikdash v'Kadosh. Aval Elu, but these animals that we just discussed, the ones from Yom Kippur and the Sirah B'Dezor, are highly unique, and therefore Einon Ru'uyin Ad Yom HaKippurim L'Shana Haba. The only time any of these will be royal to be brought on the Mizbeach for a similar type of purpose will be next Yom Kippur. The problem is next Yom Kippur, it already passed the Lishka. So you can't possibly use carbonas that were designated for this Yom Kippur for the next Yom Kippur, because it's from the wrong kupa. The Hilchach, since they cannot be repurposed, all you can do is Yamusu, Kedin Chatosh, Shekippur Baileha, like every other carbon Chatos. If it got lost, and they bought another carbon and brought it, and then they found the original carbon, they just leave that to die. Right, and they're remembered with the Rosh Tevis of Visimna. Visimna are the five letters of Visimna represent the five types of chatois that cannot be repurposed. You leave them to die. Vav stands for Vlad Chatos, and Sov stands for Tmuras Chatos, and Mem stands for Mesu Baileha, and Nun stands for Nischapur Baileha, which is our sugya, and Ayin stands for Avar's Manai. If it was too old, the animal became too old to be used as a carbon. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. But Rabbi Shimon, no, even in this case, Yirachi Yustavu, you let them go into the pasture until they get a mum, and then you could sell them. V'yimachu, you'll sell them. V'yipnu the mem l'nedava, and you'll use that money for a carbon nedava. She'ein chatos tzibur mesa. This that is halacha l'moshe misinai. That a chatos that has one of these 5 conditions is left to die. That only applies to a personal chatos, but a communal chatos does not have this rule. But for the Gemara, why do you have to be poided? Why do you have to leave it to die? These are all communal karbanos. If they're all communal karbanos, why don't you say that when Bezdin was originally designating this animal for the carbon, it was lev Bezdin masnaleim, that, for instance, if they get lost, they should not have a din of kedushas aguf. So using lev Bezdin masnaleim is like a silver bullet that you can use to allow redemption of any carbon. As Rashi says, sheyiftu b'lay mum. Zok to Gemara, that's not a kasha. You know why? Avudin comment. You're asking me from a rare case where an animal designated for Yom Kippur service is going to get lost. Shainu avudin de lo shchichi. It's such an uncommon thing. They're not going to make such a condition. When they buy these animals, they're not going to say, well, we were saying it shouldn't take on Kedushas Guf just in case it gets lost. It's an unusual thing, and they don't make these conditions for unusual cases. I will demonstrate that they do make these Tanoim even for highly unusual cases. Hooray, Para Aduma is very not Shchiach. Rashi says, in all of the second Beis HaMikdash, in all of the days combined, between the first Beis HaMikdash and second Beis HaMikdash, almost 1,000 years, Loi Asu El Sheva. There were 7 of them in 1,000 years. Much less shliach than any animal brought on Yom Kippur. It's the Loi Shchicha, and we'll demonstrate that they had a love bezd and masna leim over there. With Tani Milord, the Para Aduma, niftis al kol psol shava. Anything that goes wrong with it, they could be poided without letting it get a mum. Mesa, if it died, tifta, they could be poided. Nishchita, if it was shechted, tifta. So Rashi says, what do you mean? If you shechted it, it's a paraduma. So Rashi says, if you shechted it in the wrong place, so it wouldn't be kosher for a paraduma, but it is very dead, so you could be paid it. Or even matzah acheres nohimena. People treat their paraduma like their wives, right? Matzah acheres nohimena. If you found a nicer paraduma, you could also be paid it, tifta. But shachta gabe marachta, which basically now it's mamish an active paraduma, ain law pedia ilamis. You could no longer be paid. But our question is, why is it ain law pedia ilamis? If the whole paraduma, you would say leiv bezin mas nalayim. So why is there no pedia? Why is there no pedia? I'm sorry, I'm pungfakert. Once it takes on the kedusha, it's mamish a carbon. There, it's a mamash paraduma. There, you can't. But up until then, for every little thing, you could be pointed. So you clearly see how can you justify it? It must be because it was lev bez the masnalayim, and paraduma is so rare. Nevertheless, they did have this kavanah when they designated that paraduma that they should be able to be pointed. And for the Gemara, that's not a kasha. Shiny par the kedusha the kache bedek abayisi. The whole kasha from paraduma is no raya. You can't bring any raya from there at all. Because a paraduma, by definition, is not kedushas aguf. It's not a carbon. And therefore, it is not going to take on this kedusha, so there's never a problem. It's always bedek abayis. Right, the Gemara, ihachi, mesa, nishcheda, tifta. If that's the case, if it died, or if it was geshachten, you could be poided. Is that what you're saying? It's bedek abayis. Since it's bedek abayis, you could be poided. Right? How could you be poided? There's a rule. The Torah says that when you're poided, an animal, it says the hemed oisay lefnei hakoyin, the herech oisay hakoyin. There's a xeris hakosov that the animal has to be able to stand on its 4 feet and stand in front of the coin, so the coin could assess it. A dead animal that cannot occur. So if you're telling me that a paraduma has a din of bedek abayis, it would be impossible to redeem it once it died, because you wouldn't have the condition required of hamada bayracham. And for the Gemara Hamani, this whole brayso that we quoted from paraduma, Rabbi Shimon is going according to Rabbi Shimon. The Omar kachem izbeach hayu bechlal hamada bayracha, but kachem bedek abayis lo hayu bechlal hamada bayracha. So this whole brayso that we quoted from, that the paraduma you could always be paida. Side speaking that paraduma is bedek abayis, and the side's going according to Rabbi Shimon that bedek abayis doesn't require hamada bayracha, so that you could easily redeem it even though it's no longer alive. Practically, Gemara, I'm going to prove to you that this Mishnah of paraduma is not going according to Rabbi Shimon, because there's another thing in this Mishnah that is stated, in this brayso that is stated, that is clearly not consistent with Rabbi Shimon. Because here Rabbi Shimon ain't safe. Shachta al gabi ma'rachta, if you shechted it where it's supposed to be shechted, which Rashi says is in Har HaMishcha, in the place where you know there's no kever below it. So if you shechted it in its exact place where it needs to be shechted, now it takes on the full kedusha of a paraduma, and therefore ein law kediyah lamas. According to Rabbi Shimon, even after you shechted it, you could be pointed. Where do you see Rabbi Shimon says this? And this is from one of the most famous Gemaras. It's a full blot. We're about to quote a full blot Gemara on Daf Ayin Aleph Amud Aleph in Bava Kama. But Tanya Rabbi Shimon Omer Para Betama Tumas Eichlin Hoyel V'Hoyshel Shasa Kosher. Remember that massive toises? I think it's Bava Kama Daf Ayin Aleph and Aleph. Massive toises. The whole blot is one line. Remember chatting more to Mr. Becker. You know who Mr. Becker was? He was the math teacher in Philadelphia. And he said, I don't know what that line means, but whatever it was, it must have been a good line, because there's a whole lot of toises on it. There's a big toises on it. And it's brought down that toises was written by the Baalei Toisvis the day before they were taken out to be killed in the Crusades. And the Baalei Toisvis lived during the period of Crusades, and they were persecuted terribly, and they wrote that long toises on Par Matama Tumas Eichel, Hayvais L'Shasa Kosher. He wrote it that night. So what does that mean? You would think a paraduma, anything that could never be eaten, will not have tumas oichel. Tumas oichel means if you shecht an animal and you're going to be eating that animal, before you shecht the animal, it can't become tumas oichel because it's a live animal. The moment you shecht it, now it's already food. Once it's food, it will be tumas oichel. The question is, could a paraduma become tumas oichel? Let's think about it. Before you shechted it, it's not food, it's alive. After you shechted it, it's already asur banal, it's paraduma. So how could it ever be considered an oichel? If it even was an oichel, or it could have been an oichel, for a moment, it automatically gets a din of an oichel gabi tumah. Shimon held that a paraduma is an oichel gabi tumah. How is that possible? Because the Amar Shlokish, where Shlokish said, Omer Hayer Rab Shimon, paradiftis al gabi ma'rachta. You know why it's considered an oichel? Because after you shecht it, you could still be paided. So clearly, Rab Shimon says that you could be paid a paraduma even after it was shechted. That's very inconsistent with the brayso that we just quoted, because the brayso that we just quoted says black and white that once the par is shechted on its maracha, you can no longer be paid. So you cannot rely on Rab Shimon to explain this brayso, which means you cannot say that paraduma is bedek abayis, and that Rab Shimon holds that bedek abayis doesn't need amad of aracha. So therefore, we're back to square one. Why is it that you could be paid it? It must be because of lev bez and masna leim. Paradum is not shchiach, and for something that's not shchiach, the Gemara said earlier, there's no lev bez and masna leim. And the shiny para hoyel v'damer yikarin. We're going back to lev bez and masna leim. The argument was, the kasha was, for something that's so not usual, the Rabbanan are not masna on it, that it should stay chulin, or that it should stay bedek abayis. The paraduma is different, because a paraduma is so expensive. When you're buying something that's so expensive, you want to make sure to protect the value of the tzibur, and therefore, even though it's so unlikely, nevertheless, they still made a leves and masnale. Okay, Gevalt. Amar. Now we're going to go weiter at the tab a little more. But before we do that, I want to show you at that long that you have in Bava Kama, we actually have it here as well, in an abridged version. If you look at Tosh's part of Mifurish b'makamacher, I already wrote about it. So if you want, you could feel free to go look it up. Okay. Zog to Gemara Vacher. Amar. Mesa, if the animal died, the paraduma died, tifta you could be paid. Gemara, what exactly are you going to do with this dead ox, dead para? It's a dead cow. What exactly are you going to do with this dead cow? The only thing you can do with this dead cow is serve its meat to dogs. It's an avela, right? Gemara, the halacha is you're not allowed to. You're not allowed to serve kachim that you were paida to dogs. So anyway, that's just going to be left to rot. You'll bury it. So therefore, what are you being paid for? Actually, there's still the value of the hide. Now that's a small pittance compared to the value of the whole animal, but that's what we're being paid for. We're salvaging on behalf of the tzibur the value of the hide. The kaimu bezdin umasnu adaita da'ira. Are you telling me that bezdin is going to make such a whole big deal over an item as or which is of such little value? Zok to Gemara, Amr of Kahani, Amr Yinchi, those, every penny of the tzibur, you have to be careful with the value. Amr Yinchi, Migamla Una, a person who has a big camel that's worth thousands that dies, he'll even be insistent on salvaging even the ear of the camel if there's some value he can get out of it. So yes, when you have something of value, you try to protect any little bit of value that it has. And yes, there will be a lev bezn masnaleim even for the hide of the paraduma. Right? A donkey ear? An oxtail. Oh. Did you find a sirloin steak? Gewaltig. How long is an ox's tail?
Well, I don't know what the end of it.
Is it really the tail, or is it a piece of meat that's called the ox's tail?
I don't know. It must be the word attached.
Uh-huh.
It's a round thing. It's like this thing. That's it.
So that's it. Mamish. Inchi megam lo'ula. Every little bit counts. Zog to Gemara. Esve. So the Gemara had a kasha. Amr lo'ila Rab Shimon. In our Mishnah, the other Tanoim asked Rab Shimon, Mao sheyikravu zebazeh. If you remember, Rab Shimon was the exclusive one. He said that the sira nasa b'fnim is exclusively to be mechaper on somebody who had a yediyah mitchila and not a yediyah b'soif. He said the sira mishtaleach is exclusive for someone who had a yediyah b'soif and not a yediyah b'tchila. And he said b'shchodesh is exclusive for somebody who was tar, who ate kachim that was tamei, and the sira regalim are exclusive for a case where someone walked into the Beis Hamikdash and he was tamei, and there was no yediyah b'tchila and no yediyah b'soif. So what if one gets lost? Can you replace it with another one? Amalu, no problem. Yikravu. Amuloi, so they asked him, Hoyel ve'in kaparos and shaveh, if they don't all are mechaper of the same avera, they all have their own specific avera that they're earmarked for. Heichen krevin zebazeh. How could you possibly use one to substitute the other? Amalani, he said it doesn't matter. It's one big happy family. Hulan boyin lechaper al tumus mikdash v'kadosha. Freik the Gemara, if you hold of Lev Bezdin Masnaleim, Reb Shimon could have had a much better teretz. He could have said simple, Vamai, Lema, Lev Bezdin Masnaleim. All Shimon could have said is, yes, you can't use one to substitute for the other. But it's Lev Bezdin Masnaleim. That's like a get out of jail free card. Why did he have to say that it's iceberg Goldberg, it's all the same thing? That's basically what he said, right? Iceberg Goldberg, it's all the same thing. So Gemara, Reb Shimon Karmit, you're asking me a catch on Reb Shimon? Guess what? Rab Shimon Lesle Lev Bezdin Masnaleim. Rab Shimon doesn't even hold the whole concept of Lev Bezdin Masnaleim. We said it according to the other Tanoim. The Omer of Idi Bar Avin, Omer of Amram, Omer of Yochanan. Temidin Shaloi Hutzchu L'Tzibur. This exact halacha that we started this suli with on Yudamid Beis. L'divrei Rab Shimon ein niftin tamimim. It's only l'divrei Chachamim niftin tamimim. So therefore, everything stems perfectly. We know our Shimon in our Mishnah had to find some other reason why you could allow one animal to be used for a similar type of offense. He couldn't use Lev Bezdin Masnaleim because he disagrees with the whole premise, and therefore he needed his terutzim. But the Rabbanon, they're the ones who hold Lev Bezdin Masnaleim. Now the Gemara wants to know, who is this Rabbanon? Where do we find any Mishnah this concept that clearly allows it? Rabbanon the Pligi Alei Rab Shimon and allows Lev Bezdin Masnaleim. Manin, who are they? Identify them. name a Rabbanan Dictaris, if you aren't going to want to say it's the Rabbanan of the mission of the Bryce of Ketores that we quoted that they do this buyback scheme. So clearly that only works with Lev Bez and Masna Lim. It can't be. That's not a good raya. You know why? Because shiny Ketores, the Lav Bar Re'ihi. The Sionim changed the words to the Lav Bas Re'ihi. Ketores is Lav Bas Re'ihi. So therefore, that's why you could be pointed. In other words, what is the alternative to just being pointed because of Lev Bezin? Let it get a mum, and then when it gets a mum, you could be pointed. You can't do that with Ketores. Ketores doesn't get a mum. So since Ketores has no alternative, maybe only over there they rely on Lev Bezdin Masna Leim. But how do you know that for the Tamidim they would do that? Ella Rabbanon de Para. Maybe it's the Rabbanon of the Brisa of Paraduma that we quoted. Because if you look at the Brisa of Paraduma, let's look at the Lashon of Paraduma. It says Paraniftis Akal Psol Shabbat. So how do we know that this is the Shita of a Yachid? How do we know there is a Rabbanon who argues on this? We know there's a Rabbanon that argue. We know that there's a Rabbanon over here. Because we know this can't be Reb Shimon, because we've already identified that Reb Shimon argues with this whole brisa because he holds parim v'tamid t'masaychon. So Reb Shimon holds you could even be paid the paraduma after Rosh Hashanah. So it can't be Reb Shimon. So maybe it's the Rabbanon who argues with Reb Shimon. Maybe it's that Rabbanon that we're talking about. Zok Gemara. Dilma shiny para the demei yikarin. Maybe dafka paraduma they made this allowance. They relied on this concept of levez and masnalem because it's demei yikarin. And maybe since it's demei yikarin, the Rabbanan will make this tonight. But how do you know for a regular carbon tamid we would do that? The elo Rabbanan the amrulai. Maybe it was the Rabbanan of amrulai. Who's amrulai? In our Mishnah, amrulai they told Reb Shimon, if you're going to say that each carbon is earmarked for a specific avera, so how are you going to use one to replace the other? Bishlam, according to us, it's not an issue. It's lev bezin masnalein. But according to you, who doesn't hold lev bezin masnalein, and you hold each carbon is exclusive, what are you going to do? So Reb Shimon had to answer, it's all one big category. But maybe the Rabbanan of our Mishnah is the Rabbanan who clearly holds of lev bezin masnalein. Zok Gemara, you don't have a raya. The way you're going to understand the Mishnah to illustrate that the Tan in our Mishnah who's arguing on Reb Shimon holds of Lev Bezin Masnalein is because this is how you are going to understand the comments of the Rabbanan in the Mishnah as follows: Bishlam according to me, the Amina Lev Bezin Masnalein. I hold of Lev Bezin Masnalein, so there's no issue at all substituting one carbon with another. But according to you, Rab Shimon, who holds you don't say Lev Bezdin, Darmit Loi, so then Ama Yikrivu, how could you be makriv one for the other? Zok Gemara, you don't have a raya that's what the Amrulai holds. You know what the Amrulai holds? Amrulai might be Rab Meir. The more Rab Meir, what did Rab Meir say? He held that all of these karbonis are good for all of these averis, so they surely can substitute each other. So maybe this is what they meant when they said Omer Loiler of Shimon. Bishlam Amina Kalasi Irin Kaparos and Shava. Bishlam, according to me, where naturally all of these carbonos can substitute each other because they all come for the same Aveira. Mishum Haka Yikrivu. Eladidach Ama Yikrivu. So at the end of the day, we don't really have a Tana that we can point to with clarity and say this Tana holds of Lev Bez Masnalim by a regular carbon tamid. So who is the Rabbanon, this elusive Rabbanon that we're trying to find? So the Gemara has a very good way out of this. Rabbi Yochanan, Gemara Gomerla, L'divrei Rab Shimon, Ein Niftin, L'divrei Chamim Niftin. Rabbi Yochanan must have heard it from his Rebbe that there's such a machlokes, and there is a Rabbanon who holds a Bezin Masnalan, but we can't point to who it is. But Rabbi Yochanan's Rebbe taught him. Frank Morton, Rab Shimon, the Lesley, Le Bezin Masnalan. So my Avdin Luhu. What are you going to do with these carbonis? In other words, the whole sugya started, we have these 4 extra animals, Kamer Chodesh Nisan, that are from the last kupa. If there's no Lev Bezin Masnalim, how could you pay them? What do you do with them? What do you do with them? you have to buy karbonos that are for Ketzim Mizbech, which means you wait till they get a mum, you pay to them, and with the money you buy oilos that you could bring on them. No, I'm sorry, I'm wrong. I'm not. You could use these animals directly because these are a tamid is a carbon oila, and a carbon of Ketzim Mizbech, it just means to give extra to the Mizbech. That's also a carbon oila. As Rashi says, Makipin ben Mizbech, Keshem Mizbech bottle, if it happens to be a slow news day and there's not a lot of karbonis, so there's time and place and slots available to burn karbonis. Makriv said oila lenidvas sibor. You just makriv it as an oila, which is really what the carbon tamid is anyway. So there's no modification required and there's no pedia required. Kiddush ma'in leather Rab Shimon damar b'mesnisin gabe seir shloik karev bazeh yikra bazeh. Mishum taima dechulan boyin lechaper al tumas mikdash v'kadoshev. If it's a similar carbon, you can use it anyway. So here, it's instead of being the oilas tamid, it's a oilas of Ketzim Mizbech. Avagav v'lav hainu dahi kapar gufa. Even though it's not the identical kapar, but given the shaycha b'miktsasa karvla. Since it's in that general category, you can repurpose the animal for that alternative purpose. Hakanami elu shalukhu l'tzarech timidin. These animals that were originally purchased to be carbon tamid, and they weren't needed for the carbon tamid. Yikruvu l'keitam mizbeach. You can just be mark of them as extra kabbalas in the mizbeach. Sharei l'shem oilahu v'shu the keitz nami oilahu l'kamen mefarish ma'al loshen keit. What I was struggling with this, and I don't have an answer to it, is do they have to be mark of it that day quickly before it goes to the next day, or could they use that also for the kabbalas of keitzim mizbeach that are communal? Do they also have to be dafka from the current lishka, or could they be from the past lishka? So these 4 extra animals, do they have to be mak of them today, or could they be mak of them even in future after we're on the new lishka? I wasn't sure about that. Does he say anything about that? Okay, so we'll stop here in Beshem. We will mamshich tomorrow. So we're out of the. I think we finally emerged from the sugya of less b'yediyah b'tchila.